Good morning, afternoon, evening. We can't currently see you, but I can feel your excitement about what is sure to be a bright spot in your day. Welcome Change is Ashoka's weekly news series where we meet social entrepreneurs and hear what's working and what's coming next. My name is Lisbeth. I'm calling in from Washington, D.C., and I'm absolutely delighted to be here with Bianca Tylek, a new Ashoka Fellow from New York and founder of Worth Rises, the only organization in the US focused on removing the powerful financial incentives for incarceration. Hi, Bianca. Good to see you.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for having me.
Before we jump in, a quick reminder about the format here. We have 30 minutes today, and so Bianca, you and I will talk for about the first 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll turn to a few of your questions before we wrap up. So when you're curious about something, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we can dive in. So because most people on this call are being introduced to your work for the very first time, I thought we could begin with a few cold, hard facts about incarceration in the US, and then conclude with the fabricated resurrection of a former US president named Abraham Lincoln.
Sure.
How does that sound?
Sounds
Good?
great.
Okay. The United States incarcerates more of its people than any other nation in the world. And despite the financial and societal costs of the prison system, which fall disproportionately on Black, Brown, Indigenous, and low-income communities, incarceration rates remain at extreme levels, and advocates for reform have celebrated only incremental wins. Why haven't we moved the needle? And when you started Worth Rises in 2017, what did you see that others were missing?
Absolutely. So, I think I want to say that at this point we have definitely celebrated, I think, more than just incremental wins. I think the movement is been able to do some really incredible things, especially in the last few years when criminal justice really kind of took main stage and I think became an issue or a topic area that people started paying attention to. And so, yes, it's absolutely true that we still have more people incarcerated, per capita than just about any nation in the world. But that population has finally decreased and actually, has saw its peak a few years ago and is now on the decline. And importantly, the American populace is behind criminal justice reform. I think has finally seen that mass incarceration is not the solution to public safety or any other social issue, even though that's how we like to use it as as the way in which we solve poverty and substance abuse and mental health issues. We sort of just disappear people, right? As sort of the radical ancestor Angela Davis likes to say, who, is still fighting this fight after many decades. We disappear people inside, and that's what we do. But luckily, as I was saying, sort of research has shown the American people are seeing through this and are not continuing to support tough on crime policies, and that, political candidates and others that want to push these types of things are not, continuing in that landscape. That said, I think where we come in and what we really wanted to do when we started back in 2017 is start to address a part of mass incarceration that did go largely unaddressed for many, many years, at least in a systematic and strategic way. And that is the issue of the industry that stands behind mass incarceration, right? Behind the 2 million people who are incarcerated is an $80 billion industry. An industry that benefits when we put more people away and for longer, right? And so those type of that type of sort of space is really where we came in, and we were like, well, hold on. If there are these folks who have this financial interest in increasing incarceration, that seems problematic for our movement. And if we're trying to get people free, then we need to really challenge and remove the obstacles created by those who want to lock people up. And so that's what we started to do in 2017 when we founded Worth Rises with the, very clear and simple, though clearly magnanimous in some ways, but goal of dismantling the prison industry and ending the exploitation of people who are incarcerated and their loved ones.
As you're referring to, these powerful private interests shape every single aspect of the prison system. So from the food that people eat to the incentives that are encouraging sheriffs to keep prison beds filled, to the very brick and mortar of these structures. And you and your team have mapped out kind of 12 key sectors within this industry. And of those 12, why did you decide to go after prison telecoms first?
Sure. So yeah, as you said, this $80 billion industry, we divide into 12 sectors, and those sectors can range from telecom to healthcare, from construction to food and commissary, right? Like these are similar sectors to what you might see in the capital markets more broadly, but we are tackling them as they pertain to prisons and jails. We started with telecom. Telecom is our flagship sort of sector priority that we have been working on for more than 5, 6, 7 years now. And we started with telecom because really for two reasons. One, the problem was simple, and two, the solution was simple. And we felt like it was a problem that people could understand. The $80 billion prison industry, it's deep. There's a lot of predatory practices that we can, try to start explaining, but it's a hard place for people to start, right? To just like jump in and try to make sense of this like really intricate web. And so we wanted to simplify that, right? And help people just start to begin, like put their toe in the water on what is the prison industry? What do we mean when we say the prison industry is this predatory place that exploits incarcerated people, their families, and relies on incarceration for their business, their wealth, their livelihood, and all these things. And so, what's a phone call? Right? Like it's not that complicated. It's super simple to talk to people about what is the importance of a phone call to you, right? And like that's actually something most of us don't think about every day, because it's so freely accessible to us to be in communication with the people that we love, that we care about, that we work with, the things that we need, right? We can all pick up the phone. And so it was one of these concepts. It's like, that's simple. And it's 2024. Ask yourself why in 2024, anyone is going into debt over the cost of a phone call. Right? Prison telecom is a $1.4 billion industry on its own. It is dominated by just 3 companies that own 90% of the market share, 2 companies that own 80% of the market share. All 3 of those are owned by private equity firms, which means they're also, dealing with the realities of like financial based owners and how they drive, businesses in particular. And, they made their billions by charging people who are incarcerated and more accurately, their families, egregious rates for phone calls, for video calls, for anything that they're introducing in terms of communications. And what are we like talking about? We're talking about until recently as much as $25 for a 15-minute phone call. Then that came down when they felt like they were doing it $1 a minute for a phone call. It's 2024. None of us pay like $4 per minute for phone calls, period. Right? I have some ridiculous bill that I get from Verizon every month, but I actually went and looked at exactly how much I pay per month for the phone service, because most of what we actually pay for is data plans and all these other things. It's $8. And it's like $8 the entire month to be on the phone as much as I want, right? And so that was, us kind of talking to people and saying this is what we're talking about. We're talking about 1 in 3 families with an incarcerated loved one going into debt over simply calls and visits. those costs, right? That because 1 in 3 are going into debt, so many end up having to cut off communication with their loved ones entirely. And what does that do? That creates tensions inside, which spurs violence. There's really no place where it's more dangerous than standing in front of a phone inside, because of the dire human need for people to be in touch with the people that they love and the way in which that's extorted every single day in our facilities. It cuts off people's ability to plan for release. People who are in touch with their families are more likely to have housing when they come home, more likely to have employment, more likely to come home and have a support network that can help them stay home, right? And so it just was this like super simple problem that everyone could relate to with a super simple solution. In 2023, we can provide free communication. It's actually not expensive. It is the most cost-effective program you will ever give a penny to, right? It'll be available to every person who's inside the day they get inside, so that they know people still care about them, that they can engage in their own rehabilitation while there and come home ready to be successful in our community. And it's phone service on every single New York City block today in 2024. You can make a free phone call as a New York City resident anywhere in the country. If we can do that on our city blocks, we can do that in our facilities.
Yeah. On that point, in 7 short years, I would say Worth Rises has passed legislation in 5 cities, correct me if I'm wrong here, 5 states, and at the federal level to make communication free for incarcerated people. You've diverted hundreds of millions of dollars in investments from the prison industry and put millions of dollars back into the pockets of communities with incarcerated loved ones. Can you help us understand how you have been able to accomplish this much in such a short period of time?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I think you're right if I count properly. We passed the first piece of legislation in the country to make phone calls free in a jail system in 2018. And that went into effect in 2019. That was in the city of New York. And that piece of legislation that provided free communication was a 1-sentence bill. Saved directly impacted families close to $10 million a year. I said earlier that it's really families that are paying for these calls. Why? Because people who are incarcerated, if they make anything for their labor, they're making a few cents an hour, right? Imagine working an hour and not being able to afford 1 minute of a phone call. Like that's actually what we're talking about in some places, right? So you can work a full 8-hour day and afford 8 minutes on a phone. And in jails or in other places where people don't work at all, it has to be the family members that are paying for this. And as a result, 87% of those who are carrying the burden of the cost of calls are women, women in the community, right? And so when we passed this piece of legislation in New York City, we saved impacted families in New York City $10 million annually on that piece of legislation. And we were able to replicate that in San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, Miami as of yesterday, finally approved its contract that will go into effect soon. And so, these counties and with our local partners and all of these places, getting to a place of free communication. And then in 2020, it was incorporated, the policy was incorporated into the Federal CARES Act. It's one of the only components of the Federal CARES Act that continues today, where everybody in the federal prison system, the biggest prison system in the country, has free communication. In 2021, we passed Connecticut, our very first state bill, to make communication entirely free across the prison system of Connecticut. And importantly, we're not talking about like 10 minutes of free calling per day or anything like that. I'm talking about fully free communication. Like if you pick up the phone at any point in the day, you will be able to talk to your loved one so long as they answer the phone on the other end, right? In 2022, we passed California. In 2023, we passed Colorado, Minnesota, Massachusetts. And this year we're running close over a dozen bills, with fingers crossed, some hopefuls that'll get across the line. You don't win every fight that you bring the year that you bring it, right? It took us 3 years in Connecticut. It took us, more in Massachusetts. So it takes time, but we get there. And I think, to date, I want to say that we've been able to save families over $400 million in the cost of communication in prisons and jails. And that number obviously exponentially grows every year as these policies continue and are now law in these states. But in addition to that, and I want to like draw special attention to this because I think it often gets lost in this conversation, is that we've also been able to create 2 billion additional minutes of call time. Like that many more people are able to just hop on the phone with their children, their spouses, their grandparents, right? Who are serving time, right? And who need that support. And so that is like really tangible human connection that, we're really grateful to have been a part of in all these different places. And how do we like go about doing this? We have a very small team. So I think that's always like really shocking to people because I think everyone thinks you need an army to do all of this. And I will say kudos to my team. Definitely a team that punches way above its weight class. But today we're 11 people. Over the last 5 years, we've been as small as 3. Most of that time we were probably 5 to 7. And so, doing this work takes a lot of things. One, I think it takes partnership. We work with incredible partners in every single jurisdiction that we work in. So if we're working, in San Diego or in San Francisco or in Los Angeles or in Miami, we're working with people on the ground there, right? And that means we're taking different positions. We might be in a leadership position in one community. We might be in a supporting position in another community. We might be just guidance or advisors in yet another community. Just helping people understand how to do this as the folks who've done this for the longest across the country. So it means being in community, being in coalition, being in partnership with advocates on the ground, family members, impacted people, all of that. I think that secondly, it means knowing your shit. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but we know what we do. We know the industry incredibly well. And so we are able to provide that guidance and be a lens into the industry in a way that most of our partners cannot, simply not being as close to it or having spent as much time with it. And so, there's nothing that surprises us at this point. There's nothing that the industry can articulate or that, government can articulate that we don't know. And that leads me to maybe my third point, which is really our like secret sauce, right? I always say that our secret sauce is a 3-pronged strategy to every campaign. And that is 1, narrative change, 2, policy change, and 3, corporate accountability. And on the narrative change side, it's really the reality that we need to be telling the stories. For this industry has existed for 4 decades. And, for much of that time, the amount of scrutiny that it's gotten has been very, very limited, right? There's been a lawsuit here or there. But in terms of really trying to change or turn the dial on what it looks like in the media for these companies to get the heat that they should be getting. That was, really a big part of our strategy. It was to tell the stories of mothers and daughters and grandmothers who are the ones going into debt, who are the ones trying to support their loved ones inside with this incredible burden of the mothers who, told me I would rather sit in the dark and be able to answer my phone because I can talk to my son in the dark. Because they skipped, utility bills and light bills and things like that. But that phone line was never going to go out in order to support their loved ones. So, that kind of storytelling and really helping people understand what the industry is. On the policy side, it was going to all these states and introducing, pieces of legislation and demanding that like we can do better. If you really want public safety, this is one of the best things you can invest in a prison or jail. It's so cheap and it has these incredible returns. And it's just humane, right? And then finally, on the corporate accountability side, we targeted the companies very directly, very aggressively, very sharply, right? And so, that meant targeting the private equity firms, going to their investors, getting investors to deny or pull investments. It meant, making sure that every single article that's written about one company, mentions their ownership all the way up to the person that sits at the top. I say every company has people at it, and those people make decisions, and those people are who you need to hold accountable. And so it also meant removing the executives of these companies and their private equity firms from the boards of major museums, which we did in 2019 when we or 2020, excuse me, when we removed Tom Gores, the head of Platinum Equity, the owners of the largest prison telecom company, Securus, from the board of the LACMA. It means all these things. And today, we've blocked mergers that these companies have tried to execute. We have blocked sales of the companies. And literally just this morning, news came out that they are on the brink again of, well, I say again because this has been the last few months of discussion, of bankruptcy. And so, this is a company that earns over $700 million a year, that in the last 5 years, we have dismantled.
In addition to the kind of secret sauce of the narrative, the policy change, public accountability, a big piece of this is bringing these companies out of the shadows, right? And part of that has been kind of your financial expertise and your ability to work back these systems and these incentives, and also a public database that started as a series of reports, but has now become a really powerful tool for anyone trying to access data about corporations that are benefiting from incarceration. Can you talk a bit about that tool and how it's being used right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's right. I think this industry has been as successful as it has because it's been in the shadows, because it's been under a veil. And our job in many ways over these years has been to lift that veil and to say, no, see these people, see these companies, see who's here, and hold them accountable. And so we developed a database that started as an Excel spreadsheet, a very long Excel spreadsheet with thousands of names of corporations that are engaged in the prison industry, and is now a searchable online digital tool that anyone can access. If you just go to data.worthrises.org, you can pull up a searchable database looking for anything you want that has over 4,000 corporations in it that are engaged in the prison industry. Today, we license that data to investment shops, so folks like InvestNet or Open Invest, that provide screens for retail investors and their financial advisors to help screen your investment portfolios from the most toxic of these companies. And so we rate, every publicly traded company on a harm, with a harm score, and based on that harm score is how they either get marked for divestment as a divestment target or not. But that tool, is one that people can use endlessly for their own research.
Beautiful. And in the earliest days of experimenting with this strategy, which you have a proof of concept with telecoms, but now is really in a state where others can pick it up. Like the ball is rolling. It enables your team to be involved at different kind of tiers of engagement, et cetera. And you are able to turn your attention to the 11 other sectors that are working in this space. So kind of quickly, but where is your attention going now, and why?
Yes, thank you for that. So for sure, our plan was always to start with telecom and then start, looking at all of the other sectors in this industry, where we have, pivoted some of our attention. And I would say telecom is still a big part of our portfolio on any given day, but where we've put a lot of our attention is now in labor, is certainly one really important area. And I mean, I think this kind of goes with that saying, when you think about people being exploited, there's nothing more obvious than the exploitation of one's labor. And, what we know about prison labor, right? Which is that, in 7 states, the majority of people who are working in those states still in prison, I should say, still do not earn anything. In most states, the average wage for people who are incarcerated is 14 cents an hour. for the majority of jobs. And so, I think talking about that is a clear, obvious like necessity. When you talk about how much something costs inside, talking about how much people actually earn is a big part of that equation, right? Because, a bag of chips in prison, for example, is actually likely probably twice as much as it is on the outside. And people are making, what is like fraction, right, of a percentage of what we make on the outside. So, knowing that people may have to work days, if not weeks, to afford a medical copay. People don't know that people in prison actually pay medical copays, is wild, right? So labor is certainly one we're really focused in on now, and our campaign there is to end the exception 13th Amendment. So a lot of people don't know that the 13th Amendment, which we celebrate for having abolished slavery, actually includes an exception clause. In fact, 88% of Americans don't know. We polled. And that exception simply reads, except as punishment for a crime, which means that in 2024, slavery is still very much legal, so long as you've been criminally convicted, which 70 million Americans have been. And I think of our civil rights, our human rights are that tenuous. We should all be really concerned, because any mistake, any one of us can make, might mean that tomorrow, like, you don't have the protection from slavery. And also, what does that just mean about how the way that we think about people who are incarcerated and their humanity, right? So that's a major campaign that we're, working on now. And then we're also delving into healthcare has been a very, very hot topic and conversation. Really, I would say on the presses right now, especially because one of the major prison healthcare companies just filed for bankruptcy. So, we're starting to see a lot of things in this space falling apart. And as you can imagine, healthcare is actually, the lives of people in these hands. And then finally, the last area that we're kind of putting some attention in right now is what we would call community corrections, but more specifically electronic monitoring. So the monitoring of people outside of prisons and jails. I think often it's painted as an alternative. The reality is it's not. It's really a net widening effort. And as another elder in the movement likes to say, James Kilgore, what an electronic monitor does is turn your house into a prison and your family into guards. And so, it's also about trying to curb this kind of 2.0 version of mass incarceration that is in fact being lobbied for and advanced by the very same companies that private prison companies that helped create mass incarceration 1.0.
All right, let's make time for a question before we end, but I do encourage everyone, just a few weeks ago, you all launched a very creative campaign resurrecting Abraham Lincoln using AI tools to communicate his regret about the exception. And we will include the link here, but it is fascinating and kind of speaks to, you all are doing such serious work, and you are teaching a populace that knows very little about how this system works. And you're also like the creativity with which you're doing that is incredibly impressive and inspiring. So I encourage you all to check this out.
Yeah, I won't say too much more about it. Thank you so much for that, Lisbeth. I was on a panel recently at South by Southwest with the ad agency that helped us do this project. And, as Lisbeth, you just mentioned, basically, we used AI to help draft a speech for Abraham Lincoln today, training it on like former speeches that the president or speeches that the former president, had drafted or had given. And then we used, an actor the actor who played Lincoln in on the History Channel, and some Lincoln scholar, a Lincoln scholar, Harold Holzer, to like help authenticate the entire performance, the speech, all of this, to say like, what would Lincoln say about the existence of slavery today and the exception clause that he knowingly, sort of endorsed at the time. And yeah, it's, what we're calling the most famous speech never given, with his, acknowledging his grave mistake and calling on our nation to finally end this exception. It was really fun to be to do this project. and work with, an ad agency in these ways. And it was talking to the ad folks, they were like, well, it's so interesting how like creative your own team is. And I said, there's no more creative people than organizers. I was like, organizers are people who have no resources to do and create a lot, who need attention, who need all of these things. I think innately organizers and advocates are creatives. And it's really beautiful when you get to also partner with people whose like, true professions are creativity. And you can, create something pretty remarkable.
Amazing. For those of you that have to hop, we are at the half hour, but let's stay on for a couple minutes just to fit in one question from the many folks who want to know everything and more about your work. Be sure to check out the links in the chat. One question here from Michael. You are trying to remove money from this bloated system, and yet every dollar is someone's dollar, and they will presumably fight for it. What kind of coordinated resistance have you faced from those benefiting from the flow of money, and how have you gotten enough lawmakers to overcome that?
I love that question. I get this question a lot. That's a very eloquent way of saying like who's coming for you, which is usually the question. It's like who's coming for you and what security do you have? So I will say this: we've definitely gotten resistance. I think that the industry at the beginning didn't think we could be successful. I think that was really it was very arrogant, and it still is, I would say, a very arrogant industry. But yeah, at the beginning, it just didn't feel real to them. I think that like, a small organization or a small group of people could really come up against them with their billions of dollars and their, expensive attorneys and PR firms and all of these things. And I would say, what we're good at is being strategic, tactical, and surgical. Like I tell my team all the time, we don't have the resources or time to just throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. No, we like need to determine our strategy ahead of time and also be nimble and know that like if something's not working, we need to be ready to adjust and adapt. But I think, as Lisbeth mentioned earlier, and we didn't get a chance to talk about, but my background is from the corporate world. I spent, my first part of my career on Wall Street. As an investment banker, I think the reason that we have adapted the strategy that we have is because our team has a deeper understanding of exactly how this industry works. And that's what made us more successful in terms of like knowing what levers and what levers to pull and what buttons to push in terms of really creating an impact. And it was when we really killed the first of the merger deals that one of these companies had that we got a phone call, right? And that phone call was like, all right, congratulations on killing our deal. Let's talk, right? And there's been all the efforts. There's been the efforts to like pay us off. There's been the efforts to, sort of hack our systems. There's been, everything left and right. And obviously we invest and care very deeply about the security of our systems and our, staff and all of that. But I think that the industry in some ways continues to think that they can get out from under this. And I think this potential bankruptcy is really the first come to Jesus moment that like this isn't going away and we will bury you. And so, I think we're going to probably get more. But you expose something, I think you get, people on your side. And so the last thing I'll say on that is that as many people as now are organizing on the other side, we have people with wealth that are organizing on our side. So part of it is building your army while they build theirs.
That seems like a fine note to conclude on, though we could go on. Thank you so much, Bianca. It's wonderful to see you. Always good to talk to you. And thank you for the incredibly important work that you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.